U.S. Congressman John Lewis has died after a lengthy battle with pancreatic cancer, and he is going to be remembered as a champion for the civil rights movement. Lewis's legacy goes back to the 1960s and the early years of the civil rights movement, because from the very beginning, he preached nonviolence, equality, and morality. So it comes as no surprise that he eventually became known as the conscience of Congress. Reverend Al Sharpton took time to remember John Lewis. In a powerful speech this morning in New York, Sharpton said Lewis's lasting memory should help America overcome police brutality and other racial injustices.
God will give us the strength that even if we can't move this mountain, He'll give us the strength to climb. That's why John Lewis would lock arms with his fellow travelers and say, "We shall overcome." Deep down in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
Let's turn now to Uhuru Williams in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's a distinguished university professor and the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, and he also worked with John Lewis on projects that engaged young people. Uhuru, thank you for joining us. I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with how you are remembering Congressman John Lewis today.
He was such a tremendous human being. If we think about his legacy with regard to civil rights, or we talk about his 3 decades in Congress, that's really only a part of the picture. If you got to know him personally, he was someone who was deeply committed to social justice, deeply committed to racial equality, and someone who was always at the forefront of struggles for social justice here in the United States. And in that sense, I think what we celebrate about his life is the fact that he's someone who demonstrates the importance of living humbly for justice.
Tell me about the work that he was doing with you to help young people get engaged in the ongoing civil rights movement.
John Lewis joined the civil rights movement at a very young age, and he was actually activated by reading a comic book. And so he worked with an author and an illustrator to produce a series of comics on his life, the March Trilogy. And I was working with New York City educators and Congressman Lewis and others to teach and promote that series in New York City, because it was very important for Congressman Lewis to see young people seeing themselves in the middle of movements for social justice here in the United States. Very central to his mission, something that he took very seriously, and it was my distinct honor to be a part of that project.
Uhuru, we are talking about John Lewis. He's internationally recognized, but I feel like it's wrong if we don't also acknowledge Reverend C.T. Vivian, who also passed away yesterday, who was also a key figure in the civil rights movement going back to the 1960s. Many refer to him as Martin Luther King Jr.'s lieutenant. What do you remember of him? What will be his impact on this ongoing legacy?
I'm so glad you asked that, Natasha. He was fearless. And the one thing that I think we should remember about both these gentlemen is the fact that they really represent the best of who we were in a moment when, as we're looking at our current contemporary status and talking about racial justice, we're deeply committed and even willing to put their own lives on the line in order to advance the cause of social justice and racial justice here in the United States. C.T. Vivian is someone who I think, when we think about John Lewis, kind of receded from the public spotlight after the civil rights movement, but that's not actually true. He was actually very active in local politics, very active on the national scene, but someone not as visible. But we certainly cherish his contribution to the movement for African-American freedom and for racial equality and the struggle against poverty here in the United States.
Uhuru, I don't want to lump these two incredible giants of men as though they're one person, but maybe in the context of the larger movement and what they mean in America today, back then, what is it that we don't understand about what they were trying to achieve?
I think one of the things that captures the essence of both men, but also speaks to their distinctiveness, is where they were in 1968 after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. They were both in Washington, D.C., and both participating in their own way in the Poor People's Campaign. And there they were taking on what Dr. King called the triple problems of militarism, extreme materialism, and poverty in the United States. And you see across the course of both of these individuals' lives their commitment to continue that struggle. They were transformative in that regard. And really, when we think about our democracy and deepening the core tenets of what it means to stand for justice, they both represent the best of who we were in that moment and who we aspire to be. When we talk about that in the context of a contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, where once again, given the tragic murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, we're confronting issues of racial inequality and racial disparity, that these two icons would pass in this moment and yet remind us there is a blueprint and a pathway forward. And it involves activism, getting in and staying in the fight for equal justice and equal rights.
Do you feel they were motivated by what they were seeing in these last few months, as tragic as the loss of life has been, that you saw so many people out there? Do you think that motivated them, or it hurt them that the fight still continues?
I think it did both. In the case of Congressman John Lewis, if we look at his career over the 3 decades that he was in the Congress, where he shows up in terms of contemporary struggles for racial justice and social justice, he was one of the first people to speak out about the Muslim ban here in the United States enacted by President Trump. He was one of the first congressmen to speak out and join with Black Lives Matter protesters. He was the person who spoke most eloquently about the Supreme Court's disastrous decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which eradicated key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I'm just talking about this decade. So across his career, what we saw is someone who was unflinching in his regard to take on the tough issues, to speak truth to power, to always privilege, our shared humanity and the importance of tackling racial inequalities wherever they manifested themselves. I think that's going to be his legacy. In the case of C.T. Vivian, although it's a much more historical context that we think of him, what he shares is that deep commitment to understanding that we all have a personal responsibility to fight for justice and to be willing to, in some sense, not only put our bodies on the line, but in those moments when there aren't these big transformative moments like the murder of George Floyd, just in our everyday lives, find ways to make an impact and be part of the solution.
Uhuru, I want to thank you so much for your time this morning. I know it's a difficult morning for you and for so many around the world. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Natasha.
Uhuru Williams joining us from St. Paul, Minnesota.